Anyway, here we are. Peter's here. Very good morning to you.
Morning.
Even better, perhaps, than the don't go on a skiing holiday in case it upsets your fellow workers is the guy from HSBC who's been suspended from his job for referring to people who keep pushing climate change on us as nutters. He's actually been suspended from his job. He's a banker, and he's been sent home.
Are you honestly surprised?
Well,
there is the most tremendous intolerance about this.
I know.
And people in my position are just about permitted to utter a faint
I mean, I call them nutters all the time.
Squeak of disagreement.
Yeah.
But in most parts, then, it's not just the public sector now, it's every sector. All human resources departments are pretty much unsympathetic to anyone saying anything of this kind. I think there has not been freedom of speech on this issue now for some time. And even for people like me, it's wearisome. If you wanted to just say, actually, I'm not totally sure that you're right. And you can hear the thought police jangling their handcuffs immediately you say
I mean, thankfully, newspapers are one of the final kind of bastions of proper freedom, where at least you can write a column in the Mail on Sunday. And, I mean, I know that with the usual editing kind of processes that we know about, generally speaking, you write about things that other people may not want you to write about.
But there are some things which have become a complete waste of time. It doesn't matter what you say. The clouds of trolls immediately gather round, howling and screaming, and you think, well, and it's effective because you think,
is it worth it?
Why bother doing this? Is all I get is ignorant abuse, and it is all you get.
Yeah.
It doesn't advance any cause. That is the problem. That particular cause is more or less lost in public life. So I'm not surprised at all. I think it's ridiculous.
I mean, I've described it in the past, and mostly on social media, as like the sort of the crowd that used to gather outside Dracula's castle, you know, with torches. And
well, they had a real grievance, as I recall.
Well, they did, I suppose, even though it was a fictional character.
If someone's sucking all the blood out of your fellow villagers, you've got a point.
Yeah, but you know how they would suddenly
I'd take up a pitchfork if anybody in my postcode started doing that. I don't know about you.
But you know how easily distracted they are, because they'd all be standing there, you know, sort of jeering and shouting about what terrible things they want to do, and somebody would spot something over there, they'd all go running over there.
Well, there is that, yes.
And that's what they now do.
But I think we should distinguish between Count Dracula and the global warming fancy.
Well, which brings us to Ukraine rather neatly, I think, because there are those who see Russia and Vladimir Putin as Count Dracula, don't they?
Well,
and
again,
he does is bad.
It's not unreasonable. What he does is bad. He is domestically a sinister tyrant. He's crushed freedom of speech and of the press. He's made the country, which was formerly at least partly free, a lot less free, and he's launched a very stupid, wrong, barbaric invasion, which no one of any sense can conceivably support or sympathise with. But there are other more complicated aspects to this dispute which people need to think about.
Which you wrote about on Sunday.
I completely respect the people who are pro-Ukraine. I think, okay, you're welcome to that view. I don't happen to share it. I'd happily discuss it with you and say this is why I think that it's much more complicated than that you can have a war which is not justified, but which has been provoked, for instance. And I think this war has been provoked, and it's interesting that people such as Robert Kagan, one of the prominent neoconservative thinkers in Washington, D.C., and actually married to Victoria Nuland, who's in charge of the United States Ukraine policy at the State Department, has openly said in Foreign Affairs magazine that it's quite plain that the war was provoked. He doesn't in any way seek to justify it by saying that any more than I do. But I think anybody who doesn't recognise this happened just doesn't understand much about foreign policy. He also, interestingly, gives us another example of such provocation, Roosevelt's behaviour towards the Japanese in 1941 over the oil embargo, which a lot of people think Roosevelt was not terribly unhappy when the Japanese responded
with Pearl Harbor.
To war. I don't think he expected or wanted Pearl Harbor, but I think he probably wanted a nice declaration of war rather than the destruction of his Pacific fleet and thousands dead. But I think that it was, people do provoke. Germany, or rather Prussia, provoked France in 1870, and again provoked Russia in 1914. It's a thing people do, and the fact that people stupidly respond to provocation counts against them, but the fact is it's an important tool of foreign policy. Lots of things could have been done to prevent this war, and were not done, and in my view it's a disgrace, and this is a ridiculous thing.
Well, people are dying, and it's a bottom line, isn't it?
They're dying, they're being horribly injured, they're being driven from their homes, possibly never to return. It's a horrible thing. War is a hateful business, and you go, as we've discussed before, you go within 100 yards of it, you realise what a vile thing it is. It's obscenity. Yeah. So no one can be pleased about that. So why wasn't more done to avoid it? And also,
what could have been done to avoid it?
Lots of things. But you take, for instance, there was for a long period available, indeed officially sponsored by several large powers, a thing called Minsk II, which was an agreement to turn the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine into sort of Swiss federal cantons, which had different language rules from the rest and their own self-government to a greater extent than they have now. And I think most of the people living in those areas would have been perfectly content with that. They'd have stayed within Ukraine. It's just Ukraine would have become a slightly more complicated country constitutionally than it is now. I think it's a sensible compromise if the Swiss can manage with it, just as if the Canadians can give their French-speaking minority a lot of concessions on language without hurting themselves, then why not do it? But Ukraine has this very big problem of ultra-nationalists who get far more power than they should in government and have imposed language laws, for instance, which make it a disadvantage to be a native Russian speaker in a way which, if Canada did it, would be largely frowned on. Those are some of the things. Again,
so would you have seen that then as a sort of a federal state, so that it would have states of Ukraine, as it were?
Yes, something of that kind. Yeah, that was what was on offer. And Zelensky, when he was elected, and I have a lot of time for Zelensky, I don't deride him, when he was elected, he stood as a peace candidate. And what he wanted was peace. He got popular support. That's why he got so many votes. It's why he beat Poroshenko. Yeah. But he got that, he won that, and then he tried to actually implement what he stood for. And he found himself being publicly confronted by members of his own army, telling him they weren't going to do it. And also large demonstrations got up by his political opponents saying, we don't want this peace. So he's completely undermined. He's still president, but his main policy has been knocked from underneath him.
So is it an ungovernable country then as a whole?
No, it's not. If there weren't so much foreign intervention in it, and in that I place the United States, Russia, and the European Union as powers that can do and have intervened in Ukraine. If there weren't so much foreign intervention in it, it could be a perfectly happy, prosperous country. They could get on with stamping out the terrible corruption that they suffer. They could establish a decent democracy instead of the mess that they have, and they could put their economy right. At the moment, Ukraine could be one of the richest and happiest countries in the world if it were properly governed, but it isn't, because of terrible faults in it, which are not being put right by this stupid war.
Well, of course, and by whatever means it ends, if it ever does end, because it doesn't seem to be ending anytime soon, those problems will persist, presumably.
Well, in many ways they'll be worse because of this, and it is notable, and I keep saying this, that all the bodies which normally try and establish peace when war breaks out seem to have gone to sleep. And the United Nations.
Well, the United Nations hasn't done anything, as far as I can see, for a very long time. I mean, the best they've done so far is to have a General Assembly vote, generally against Russia, where the usual suspects have voted with Russia or abstained. The Security Council seems to be not worth a fag end to me. Doesn't do anything.
Well, it would work if anyone were interested in negotiation. Yeah. But it seems to me that more and more, and you get people such as our esteemed Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, the genius of Round Hay, coming out and saying that the Ukraine should demand all kinds of more and more stringent conditions before it concludes peace. Well, of course, you have to be tough when you go into negotiation. But you shouldn't draw impossible lines before you negotiate. You shouldn't box yourself into a corner. This I learned as an industrial correspondent. Yes. Always give yourself an out in any fight, because you will need it. Yeah. But we're not giving ourselves an out.
No. And the main thrust of your piece was about the Mariupol surrender, as you called it, which wasn't called a surrender. Tell us about that.
No, it's curious. That was the week I went into Marks and Spencer's and I discovered they were selling something called Chicken Kyiv instead of Chicken Kiev. Also, by the way, for those who don't like chicken, there's a no chicken Kyiv now.
Yes, I thought that was a particularly subtle
which has no chicken in it, but lots of propaganda.
But it's still called chicken. It's called chicken on it.
It's called no chicken Kyiv. Yes. So, anyway, what it tastes like, I haven't yet been able to nerve myself to find out. But in the same week when the supermarkets were engaging in partisan propaganda about a war, we then got what was quite plainly a surrender. Whatever you think of the people who've been defending the steelworks in Mariupol. It doesn't matter. What had happened was that they had surrendered. They laid down their arms. There they were. They were being frisked as prisoners of war by their Russian captors. Yet you could not get in the BBC or most of the newspapers the word surrender. Wasn't there.
No.
They were being evacuated.
Yes.
Now this is
and they were being praised for being there for so long, weren't they?
We've reached the point where we're so completely and utterly taken up with taking sides in this that we can no longer see the truth. Therefore, you can't. You can't. It's as if Putin couldn't accept that he'd been defeated when he has been defeated. Right. It's a form of madness, refusing to accept facts that don't fit your view. And here is a fact: the Ukrainians, who were constantly being told were wiping the floor with the Russians, had on this occasion been defeated and had surrendered, and no one could say the word.
Right.
And it's all part of this mindset. Again, I talked about this very senior Oxford academic who I was sitting at a table with, and I told her that the Ukrainians after 2014 had blocked off the water supply to Crimea, which they did. Crimea is very short of water, and there'd been this elaborate dam and canal system set up in the Soviet era to supply it with water, and the Ukrainians just shut it off. Now, people make excuses for this, which shocks me. The people who suffer from this are not Putin. He gets all the water he wants, or any of the senior apparatchiks. It's the people. And this is what's called collective punishment. And it's very frowned on, if not actually illegal under things like the Hague Convention. You just are not allowed to do it. And Ukraine very much broke the rules of civilized behavior by shutting off that water supply. Most people in Western countries do not know that Ukraine did this. Most people do not know that Ukrainian forces shelled civilians in the Don Basin either, and killed quite a large number of them. They don't know this because Ukraine is entirely full of angelic, saintly, wonderful, perfect people, and Russia is full of demons and orcs. And that's the view. No good will come of a misunderstanding of the world as oversimplified as that.
And perhaps it would be better, and certainly might make the settlement of the whole business quicker, if other countries, i.e. neutral countries, of which there don't seem to be any, could convince both sides to sit down and have a proper conversation.
Well, you'll notice the way that an awful lot of the British and American press is full of derision directed towards France and Germany, which are not too keen on this. And, whereas Britain, which has virtually no armed forces to speak of, acts as a sort of yapping poodle to American policy. Quite what Britain's interests are in a war in Ukraine, you'll have to tell me, because I have absolutely no idea what British interest this serves.
We mentioned just at the top there that a Russian soldier has been jailed for life after being found guilty of murdering an unarmed Ukrainian civilian in what's being called the first war crimes trial of this war, which is rather fast, it seems to me, since it's not been going that long. And also the war crimes trial has taken place in Ukraine.
Well, I don't think I've come across this before, but I mean, one could only hope that the evidence was heard properly and everything else. Who knows what's going on? The war crimes, in my experience of wars, are committed by both sides. Yeah. And the idea that only one side commits war crimes, again, is a folly of our age.
It's a bit unusual to have the War Crimes Tribunal in one of the countries that the war's going on, though.
Well, I think, in fact, there was quite an effort to prosecute some Germans for war crimes after the First World War. All of which ran into the sand, which is why more care was taken in setting up the Nuremberg Tribunal to try and get that. And then, of course, there's the famous Yugoslav tribunals. But outside that, I can't think of any real episodes, probably some in Africa where attempts have been made. It is a new thing.
Yeah, I think there was some genocide war crimes tribunals in The Hague, weren't there?
But the problem is all war is pretty much crime. And states license their own soldiers to commit what would in normal circumstances be crimes.
Yeah.
And where do you draw the line? The sort of things which people do in war are terrible, and if set before a civilian courtroom, everyone would reel back in horror and say guilty, Your Honour.
Absolutely.
But it doesn't tend to happen because the victors don't allow it to happen to their own troops.
No.
And obviously what's happening, what is likely to be happening in Ukraine is that both sides will have numbers of prisoners, and they want to make sure they have a firm hold on them so that they can do exchanges later on, which is what an awful lot of prisoner taking is about.
Yes, exactly right. Let's talk about the BBC, something else you wrote about this weekend, and a missing drama.
A missing drama, a fantastically good drama, at least I thought so at the time, which I watched at the very end of the 1960s, in 1970, as a dramatisation of Jean-Paul Sartre's great trilogy, The Road to Freedom. Absolutely wonderful
That was fantastic. I watched that.
absolutely fantastic cast of British actors of a certain generation who've all gone now.
Was it Bryant?
Michael Bryant, Daniel Massey.
I still remember the theme tune, believe it or not.
Fisk. Oh, everybody remembers.
My
the
mother
theme
in particular was a bit unsure whether I was old enough to watch it, because I think I was only about 10 or something, and there was a bit of kind of hands over the eyes at certain points. It was quite explicit.
It was
as well.
very explicit. There was very nearly full frontal female nakedness in it, which for 1970 was absolutely shocking.
Yes.
There was a lot of obvious sex in it. But it was when the BBC Two was a properly artistic channel. It was one of the first things they did in colour.
Yes,
in that wonderful sort of greenish asparagus tinted colour.
It inspired me to read the book. And the trilogy, which was brilliant, you know. And I still kind of, I don't say I lived by it, but it really had an influence on my young life.
It's an extraordinary book. I had been lucky enough, I'd read it before the thing came out, which is why I was so keen to see it.
Yeah.
And then years later, I thought, well, I wonder where's this got to, because all kinds of stuff from the BBC of that era was coming out, Civilization and so forth. And I found out there was a whole website of people saying, what's happened to this series?
Right.
Why can't it be shown? Because the BBC could have said, we've wiped it, because they wiped so much. They did. They wiped huge numbers of things. I think they wiped the first Doctor Who, didn't they? But they wipe and wipe and wipe. But they hadn't wiped it because they'd allowed a showing of all the episodes over one weekend at the British Film Institute on the South Bank in London. So everybody knew the thing existed. And there's never any answer if you ask the BBC,
but the reasoning
why can't it be
you're
shared?
Suggesting is because of the content matter.
There is some content. You see, left-wing people in 1970 had different views, particularly about sexual revolution from ones they have now. And the character played by Daniel Massey is an intellectual, wealthy Parisian homosexual who has attitudes towards his own desires, which would be considered extremely shockingly reactionary and outrageous now. Yes. Now, I think that the BBC understands perfectly well that intelligent people would grasp that attitudes have changed in the past 52 years. Yeah. But they also understand, as do we all, the huge power of the internet and Twitter to work up a storm over nothing, and the desire of people to go very long ways to be outraged. I think they fear a possible wave of outrage and being accused of promoting reactionary attitudes.
Well, almost as though context doesn't matter.
Exactly as though, and I think that must be it. But if ask them, see if they'll talk to you about it. Yeah. The last time I asked, they just were saying no plans to show it at the moment and no explanation.
And the other this drama that you were talking about, of course, the thing about the African sort of migrant situation.
Oh, amazing!
Is also for a reason presumably political.
Well, again, they didn't say there's no plans to show it, but this is extraordinarily prophetic. In 1990, with the fantastic Juliet Stevenson starring, the whole idea of the film is that an African sort of charismatic figure starts a huge march beginning in Sudan of poor Africans heading towards the North African coast and saying we're going to go to Europe, we're going to die in front of you. Yeah. What are you going to do about it? Right. And it really does point up the problem. And at that time, people still thought of the Mediterranean and indeed the English Channel as impossible barriers for people to cross, and that's why the prophetic nature is so quaint. Strong. But it turned out that they could cross, and in the drama they cross somewhere, I think near Algeciras, into Spain, and you're left hanging. You don't know what happens. The European Union deploys its troops on the shore. One person is shot at the beginning, but the end of it is not made clear. But it raises this huge problem. How does the rich world deal with the problems of the poor world without destroying itself?
Right, and we are right in the middle of episode 7
of that crisis.
We don't know what to do.
Made immeasurably worse, I should say, by David Cameron's ludicrous attack on Libya, in which I might say, I remember reading reports by the extraordinarily good reporter Martin Fletcher of the broken bodies of small children found in Libyan towns as a result of NATO bombing.
Yes, and that is the thing that nobody has really addressed. I mean, again, it's something you talk about a fair amount, but you know, what does the UK and the West do about the problems in these countries where people are so poor or so unwilling to stay there that they want to come here.
Well, we have to do something about it, but whether the best thing to do about it is to welcome millions of people here seems to me to be open to considerable doubt.
Well, that's clearly that's clearly the wrong idea.
The problem of aid, then, it's all very well saying let's send more aid, but the problem of aid so often being diverted into the pockets, and the film, The March, the Juliet Stevenson film makes this point, that aid ends up in the wrong pockets so often.
Yes.
Some way must be found of making sure that the aid gets to where it is supposed to get to, and I don't know how you do that. But what's for certain is that just saying, all right, we give up having borders altogether, that won't work.
No, it really won't. I mean, I wonder whether it would be cheaper to just go back to being the British Empire.
Well, yeah,
but unfortunately,
that age is gone. The only empire that's being built at the moment is the Chinese Empire.
Yes, and they're all over Africa.
Absolutely guarantee they are indeed very active in Africa. You absolutely guarantee that they're not going to be encouraging the populations of Africa and the Middle East to move to China.
They're certainly not, and they certainly wouldn't be allowing them to do it the way they're doing it. So, Peter, great to see you as ever. Thank you very much indeed. Peter Hitchens.